Hello YouTube, Mr. Mags here. Every Pokemon region has a Pokemon professor. They're one of the first people you meet on your journey. They usually give you your first starter Pokemon, and they're just a good introduction to the world of Pokemon. However, with very few exceptions, you don't ever actually get to battle this character. So today, I thought it would be fun if I were to create teams for every single Pokemon professor. So sit back, relax, and enjoy my presentation where I present to you the teams that I created for every single Pokemon professor. Okay, let's get right into my presentation where I'm going to give canon teams to every single Pokemon professor. Now, here's the criteria I went off of when creating these teams. First off, I picked these teams based on the professor's field of study and just their overall personality, as well as any canon Pokemon that these trainers have from the games, anime, manga, etc. Every single professor has a specific part of the Pokemon world or about the Pokemon themselves that they study. So that is the primary thing I will go off of when making these teams. I also prioritize Pokemon from their region of origin. However, that prioritization does not supersede criteria one. And by that I mean, for example, if there is, let's say, uh, there's a bunch of Pokemon from Generation 7 that really fit Professor Kukui's field of study. However, all of those Pokemon are not from Generation 7. Uh, I'll prioritize the field of study over region of origin. However, within the Pokemon that fit the field of study, I would prioritize region of origin. So that'll make more sense as I go, and I'll kind of break those down on a case-by-case basis. These teams are built independent of any canon trainer teams as well as independent of each other. So there might be a couple of Pokemon that appear several times throughout this list. I'm not really going to care that much about that. And also, uh, I'm not going to rule out any Pokemon that are aces of other major trainers. Like, for example, if I felt like the Oak deserved to have a Dragonite, even though that is Lance's ace, I'm gonna be fine giving it to Oak because I'm kind of headcanoning these to be um, post-game fights where it won't really matter as much if they share aces. And lastly, team strength and synergy is not really a factor in making these teams. I do think a lot of these teams ended up actually being pretty solid, but it was not my goal to make these actually challenging, like competitive style teams. And if I end up breaking any of these criteria, I'll kind of again mention them in my case to case basis. But this is kind of the overall rules I went off when making these teams. So first off, the first ever Pokemon professor, Professor Oak. And for each professor, I will briefly break down their field of study and then just where my mindset was when creating the team. So since he was the first ever professor, Professor Oak is just called the Pokemon professor. He doesn't have any kind of field of study, no like specific thing. He just, he essentially, as far as we know, created the Pokedex, especially at the time, created the Pokedex and is just the one guy whose job it is to research all these Pokemon. And by that, I mean he got another guy, a 10-year-old, he sent a 10-year-old out there to do it for him. But his thing is that he just, is the Pokemon professor. So in theory, I didn't really have a lot to go off of. Like, he's the professor of Kanto, so I guess he should have a bunch of cool Pokemon from the Kanto region. However, Professor Oak actually does technically have a canon team already. In the files of Red, Blue, and Yellow, there is a team that appears to be essentially what would have been a either a champion or some kind of post-game team. A lot of his Pokemon overlap with a lot of Gary's Pokemon, so the theory is that he was originally going to be the champion. Um, so the idea was for me to essentially take a lot of that team and just add a couple other things to it to make it a full, a full team that I think fully represents Professor Oak. So we have Executor, Arcanine, Gyarados, and Tauros, all from that Canon team. On that Canon team, he also had a starter Pokemon. In theory, it would be the starter that was left over, so the one that your starter will be good into. So if you pick Charizard, he would pick Venusaur. But he would always have Executor, Arcanine, Gyarados. And like I said, those three are also on Gary's team in those games. So it's heavily speculated that he was essentially going to like replace Gary as the final trainer in the league. So those four, Jolteon, as both a reference to the fact that he gives Gary an Eevee in yellow, and also I made him a Jolteon to reference Pikachu as well, to be both an Eevee and an electric type. And I like him having both Jolteon and Tauros, along with the other three there to represent all the types that he gives out as starters across all the games. And then for Nidoking, it is heavily implied across many different canon sources that the Nidorino that appears at the beginning cinematic of Red and Blue that is fighting that Gengar, it's heavily implied that that Nidorino is Oak's Nidorino to the point that in Pokemon Masters EX, one of his sync pair Pokemon is a Nidorino, and it and Oak and Agatha have a little have a little dialogue where they mention that they've battled before, which references that Nidorino and her Gengar fighting. So, since that is literally one of the, if not the first Pokemon you ever see in a Pokemon game, I think it makes sense for Professor Oak's ace to be that Nidorino evolved into a Nidoking. So, yeah, I really like this team a lot. Uh, I think it's just a good representation of the entire region. Next up, Professor Elm. His specialty is breeding. Generation 2 is the first one to introduce eggs and baby Pokemon, so I wanted his team to reflect that. However, if I were to make his team based solely on Pokemon that evolved from baby Pokemon from Generation 2, his team would look very similar to the Daycare Man's team from my previous video, which I'll link up there. Um, and I wanted just a little more variety in these presentations. So I essentially decided to make this Professor Elm team based on if it were a post-game fight in Heart Gold Soul Silver. There were a ton of baby Pokemon introduced in Gen 3 and 4 that then evolved into Generation 2 Pokemon. So I decided to pull from that just to have some more options. So we have Sudowoodo, who evolves from Bonsly, Blissey, who evolves from Happiny, Mantine, who evolves from Mantike, Wobbuffet, who evolves from Wynot, Hitmontop, who evolves from Tyrogue, which actually was from this region, Togekiss, who evolves from Togepi, who is technically a baby Pokemon. It's not really a baby in the same way that like Bonsly is, or like Smoochum or something, where it's a baby of a previous gen Pokemon. I don't exactly know what the definition of baby is because something like Toxel is in like Riolu are also considered baby, but they evolve into Pokemon from their gen. I'm not really sure, but regardless, even if Togepi weren't technically a baby Pokemon, uh, the egg that Elm gives you is a Togepi egg, so it makes perfect sense for him to have a Togekiss. And if this were Generation 2, it would be Togetic. But I think this team also just I don't know. I feel like it just fits him very well. It's probably technically the weakest team on this entire list. Like I said, I didn't really care about strength and synergy all that much, but I just think it's kind of fun to note that his team is just incredibly bulky. Blissey, Mantine, Sudowoodo, they all have incredibly high at least one stat that's incredibly high, along with Wobbuffet, uh, being HP for Blissey and Wobbuffet. Sudowoodo's high in defense, Manti is high in special defense. Him on top is very well rounded, and then Togekiss is really the only one he has that's actually a like can actually pack a punch. So I just find that interesting. Next up, Professor Birch. His was definitely the most like at least at first when I sat down to make this, the most difficult to conceptualize because his field of study is Pokemon habitats. And I didn't really know what to do with that. At first, I focused more on um, canon Pokemon for him. He actually does have several options that you can at least extrapolate that could be on his team because in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, that was the first generation, I believe, that has it where while the professor is giving you his, enter the world of Pokemon speech, he throws out a Pokemon to show you this is a Pokemon. And for Birch, he throws out an Azurill in Ruby and Sapphire, but then in Emerald, it's a Lotad. So I had some stuff to go off of that at least Pokemon that could be considered his Pokemon. However, I made a team based on, what could be canon Pokemon based on in-game and also anime stuff. And then I also decided to come back and focus more on his field of study. And I decided to essentially create a team for him based on Pokemon that can be found in very specific parts of the Hoenn region. So, for example, Glalie can only be found in Shoal Cave, that one specific ice cave above Mauville. Flygon can only be found, or like Trapinch at least, can only be found in the desert region. Chimecho can only be found at the top of Mount Pyre. Torkoal can only be found in the volcano area around Mount Chimney. Relicanth can only be found underwater in like two specific routes, like only a couple of specific routes over there. That one probably has the most places it can be, but is still specific to underwater. And then Breloom, I knew this fact, but it still felt wrong when I made this team. Shroomish can only be found in Petalburg Woods. That is kind of wild to me for how prevalent Shroomish is throughout your playthrough. You would think that it could be found on the route leading up to Ford Tree or just random grass after some other places, but no, only Paddleberg Woods can Berlin be found in. So that's cool. I personally wanted Berlin to be his ace regardless. I just for some reason really like Berlin being here. He at least cares for a bunch of Shroomish in the anime. So for another team, I'm gonna give him in just a second. I also have Berlin on that team. I just, for some reason, think it fits in well, but regardless, it just works out that Shroomish can only be found in that one forest area. But I do like how all six of these Pokemon, kind of together map out a lot of the region and all a bunch of different unique places around the region. So I dug that a lot. So that's his team based on his field of study. And then the team based on just his canon Pokemon, the Azumarill and Ludicolo, as mentioned, the Azumarill and Lotad he throws out at the beginning of Ruby and Sapphire, respectively. The Mightyena and Linoon, these are references to the Poochyena and Zigzagoon that chase him around at the beginning of Ruby Sapphire and then Emerald, respectively. And I just like the idea of him, eventually making friends with these Pokemon that he was initially scared of. I think that would be a nice arc. And I think in the anime, he actually does make friends with that Poochyena. So I'll say he makes friends with the Linoon as well. And then in the anime, he has a bunch of C dot and Shroomish that he takes care of at his lab. So Shiftry and Breloom. And for some reason in my head, I just like him having a bunch of grass types. I don't really know why. That just feels right to me. Um, so so that's his team's there. And then I kind of was started thinking a little more about his team. Maybe it's just the fact that Generation 3 is my favorite generation. Um, so I just kind of was thinking more about his team and like everything that every game he's been a part of and stuff. And, you know, in Generation 6, Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, the Gen 3 remakes, he actually does have a couple of other options I could pull from. This one might be a little goofy. This is definitely not his most canon team. I would consider his most canon team to be the one previously mentioned. That's focused more on his habitats. But um, The next team I'm going to show is one where it's specific to Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, where in those games, every time you beat the Elite Four, if you go back, I guess you spawn back in Little Root Town, the same sequence happens from the original, from when you start the game, where you see Professor Birch being chased by Poochyena, and then you can pick a new starter Pokemon, those being from the Johto region, the Sinnoh region, and the Unova region. In Emerald, it's only the Johto region after you complete the entire Hoenn Dex, but they made it a little more easy to get and also more options in the remix, and I really like that. So I thought it would be kind of fun to make a team specific to Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire with the Azumarill and my Deanna for the same reason for the other one. Breloom, just because for some reason I like him with Breloom. And then one of each of the starters that he potentially gives you. Meganium, Empoleon, Emboar. There's no real reason for any of these specifically. Like I just kind of picked Meganium. I felt like that fit him best from that batch, and then kind of picked a water and fire starter from there. Um, but yeah, I think this is a really cool team. Again, I think the first one I gave him is the most canon, but I just really like the idea of him having one specific to the remakes. So next up, Professor Rowan. His specialty is Pokemon evolutions. So I thought it would be a lot of fun if his team is made up of a bunch of Pokemon that evolve very differently. So starting with Snorlax, in Diamond and Pearl, the Pokemon that he throws out in the intro is a Munchlax. In Platinum, it's a Baneri, but I like him having or having Snorlax a little more. They both evolve from friendship, so I went more with Snorlax. Um, Not only do I just think Snorlax fits him more, he's also good friends with Professor Oak, so he can have one Kanto Pokemon. I think that's fine, especially since it does evolve from a Sinnoh Pokemon. So yes, Snorlax evolves from friendship. Glaceon in Generation 4 evolves as a location base. It has to be near this ice rock up near Snow Point. Mega, it specifically evolves by using a move, or at least level up while knowing a move. Dusknoir evolves both by trade and holding an item. Gallade is both a branched evolution, which I think is also interesting to study, but also specifically a stone evolution. And then the Staraptor is just a bog standard three stage level up evolution. And I know in the anime he has a Starly, so I feel like Staraptor being his ace fits him the best. It's honestly kind of poetic. The one that is his ace is just the one that evolves normally. So yeah, I dig this, and these are, if not all of them, at least the vast majority of the different kinds of evolutions. You can maybe argue that in the newer games, Glaceon can evolve by a stone. However, in Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, there actually was no way to get a Glaceon that way. There was no ice stone available. Um, so if you could think of another kind of evolution, please, let me know. I would like to have other suggestions for all of these trainers, absolutely. But I just really like the idea of these all these Pokemon evolving in very different ways, at least in Diamond and Pearl Platinum. Next up, Professor Juniper. She was definitely the trickiest one to make. Um, at least with Birch, I eventually was able to be more creative and I think ended up having like a very solid team or even teams for him. Um, Professor Oak luckily had an in-game team I could go off of. Professor Juniper, her thing is she studies the origins of Pokemon, and I'm not gonna give her like a Mew and a Arceus. That like like these Pokemon that were considered first. That doesn't sit right with me. Especially since they're not even like, no Pokemon from her region are considered the first Pokemon. So I pretty much exclusively had to go off of Pokemon that were canon. Uh, either in the games or anime, and then like a couple of other weird ones that I just kind of pulled from. But I think I overall made a solid enough team. So, starting with Caricasa and Archeops, they're both fossil Pokemon. I think with her studying the origins of Pokemon, fossils are something that she would study. Zenmo Darmanitan, that's something I just completely made up. Because she theoretically would be spending a lot of time around those ruins because she has a Caricasta and Archeops, and those ancient ruins maybe hold some secret to Pokemon's past, and those Darmanitan are around there. So maybe she got one at some point. I don't know. I could easily hear arguments for switching that over something else. Um, Pheasant is a very interesting choice that I luckily discovered kind of later on actually fit her very well. In somewhere in the dialogue of either Black and White and Black and White 2, it's mentioned that her and her dad technically used to be backpackers. It is a trainer class introduced in Generation 5, and they don't really use any specific kind of Pokemon. It's not like hikers, they use a lot of Machop and Graveler. Um, it's not even like Pokemon Rangers, but use a bunch of like grass types. Like it's or like swimmers that use water types, bird keepers, flying types. It's not they don't really use any specific thing. They just kind of use stuff. They have like Cottony, Pedo, Drillbur, Blitzel. Like they have just a bunch of random things. Um, so I looked at every trainer from Black and White that was the backpacker class, um, and saw if there was any that were heavily repeated, and there was a tie between I think Drillbur and Pidove. So I just went with Unfezant. I like the idea of a lot of her team being normal types from pretty early on in the decks. That being Unfezant, and then Watchhog. She's the one that does the catching tutorial where she uses her Minccino to catch Patrat, and fills out the rest of her team. This one is definitely the most mutable. I could easily see Darmanitan and Ufizin being something else. But since Gino and Watchog are the only Pokemon that we know that she has, Archeops and Caricasta make sense with her background, and also that she has them in the anime. I believe at least Archeops in the anime. So I could easily hear recommendations for switching out Darmanitan or Unfizin for something that might fit her more, but the other four I am very happy with. But I do like the creativeness with her used to being a backpacker, so she would have a Pokemon from that time, being Unfizin. Professor Sycamore, his whole thing is mega evolutions. Now, this is kind of what I was hinting at with where I said I'll be focusing on region of origin, but that won't supersede um the field of study, because unfortunately, for some idiotic reason, in X and Y, they didn't have a single Generation 6 Pokemon be able to Mega Evolve. The only Pokemon that could Mega Evolve are from Generation 1 through 4. It wasn't until Oros where they added two post-Gen 5 Pokemon, those being Audino and Diancie. And I'm not giving him a Diancie, that doesn't feel right. So I decided to make his entire team Pokemon that theoretically could Mega Evolve. Uh, we do know for a fact that when he does fight you, he actually fights you twice, once in his lab, once towards the end of the game where he uses the three starters. He doesn't even Mega Evolve those either in that final time either. You'd think he would Mega Evolve the one that's strong against the one you picked or something, but no, or just pick one that Mega Evolves, whatever. Um, so he has Venusaur, Charizard, Blastoise, Canon anyway. And then I just picked three others that can Mega Evolve. I just picked Heracross, Medicham, and then Mega Garchomp, just because I actually really like Mega Garchomp. I'm pretty sure in the anime, in that first episode, when Ash first gets to Sycamore's lab, there is a Garchomp that like runs loose. I don't know if it's from the lab or just um but regardless, he helps Sycamore take it down. So I like the idea of him having Mega Dark Chop. Heracross could easily be something else. It could either be like Ampharos or Pinsir, but ideally I didn't want him to have overlap with anyone else if possible. I know I said I wasn't really going to care too much about repeats, but Heracross and Medicham didn't have any other trainers in that region that had them as megas. Granted, there weren't that many megas in those games in the first place. There's like four total. But I definitely wasn't going to give him like Absol or Lucario since those specifically, or even like Gyarados, because those are very much so tied to other trainers. Whereas these three, as far as X and Y goes, are not. But if you do take issue with him not having any Generation 6 Pokemon, I did make another team with him having a Go-Go in in his opening spiel at the beginning of the game. He does throw out a Skidoo, so I'll say he evolved that into a Go-Go. So there you go. Professor Kukui. His He's another one that I am very glad that he actually has a canon team to work off of because his field of study is Pokemon attacks. And he makes a bunch of puns around the level around the number four because every Pokemon can know four moves. And if I didn't have a team to go off of, then it would, I guess I would just kind of have to make him have six Pokemon from Generation 7 that can learn four moves, which is everybody. Like, there's not really a lot to go off of. Like, you could argue, oh, they can learn Pokemon that can learn a bunch of different kinds of moves, but I don't really know what that would mean. So luckily, they kind of did the heavy lifting for me and already gave him a canon team. However, I'm going to show that team in the next slide, but I'm going to do some changes to it. So here's the team that he has in game. Lycanroc, Alola Ninetales, Braviary, Magnezone, Snorlax, and Cineroar. Now, it's a solid team, is a very strong team. However, I kind of take issue with it. Braviary and Magnezone don't are just seem just kind of thrown on there. Um, there's no real rhyme or reason why he has those two specifically, since there were, I feel, a lot of other Generation 7 Pokemon that didn't really get much representation. Or even in the case of Magnezone, there are just Pokemon in the decks that have significantly less representation than Magnezone does, which is everywhere. So I already did like a little rework of him in my Champions video, which I'll also link above. But I'm going to make this a slightly different alteration from that one. I'm going to keep the same types, generally speaking. Just switch out Braviary and Magnezone for Generation 7 Pokemon, those being two Canon and a Vikavolt. Snorlax can stay. I don't know. I just feel like that fits him well enough. I like him being super energetic and then having this, this big lazy beast. I don't know. I think that's fun. Um, but two Cannon being another normal and flying type from this region, and then Vikavolt being an electric type from this region. I think that, especially as a post-game fight, works pretty well. However, I had this idea for him, and walk with me for just a second. He already uses a Lycanroc and a Ninetales, two Pokemon that are different forms of the same Pokemon. Like there's another form of Ninetales, and yeah, this point, two other forms of Lycanroc. So I know that his field of study is Pokemon moves. I think it would be kind of cool if, in just a theoretical sense, his professor his field of study was Pokemon forms. Now that does kind of overlap with Samson Oak, who specifically focuses on regional variants, but he also focuses on the totem Pokemon phenomenon, and also I think that could kind of fall under the same umbrella as Rowan and Sycamore, technically having similar fields of studies. Rowan being evolutions at the whole, and then Sycamore being specifically mega evolutions. Yes, like they're similar ideas, like, but I think they both are very valid. So Kukui would be Pokemon that just have different forms generally, you know, maybe a low end forms can like be a part of that, but then Samson Oak can narrow in on why do these specific Pokemon develop differently on this island, whereas he would be more general. I think that could work. So here's the team that I gave him if he focused on forms in general. Keeping his Lycanroc and Ninetales, since, like I said, there are other forms of those. And similar to Rowan, I wanted him to have different forms that are different forms differently, if that made sense. Like Lycanroc specifically changes forms based on when the Rockruff evolves, whether it's either day or night form. Lola Ninetales is a regional variant. Meowstic, it changes forms depending on if it's male or female when it evolves. Wishy-Washy, I wanted him to have a Pokemon that changes forms during battle depending on certain circumstances. Oricorio, that one is a location-based thing, so no matter where you are on the island, it has a different form. And then Rotom, um, I like Rotom a lot because A, it has, a bunch of different forms based on what item it interacts with, but also Generation 7 was the first gen to have it where there's like a Rotom in the Pokedex that he gives you. So it makes sense that he would have access to Rotom. And I just decided Heat because he didn't have a fire type, and I his ace I canon in my head to be Incineroar, so I'll keep his ace being a fire type. And there might be a couple of other like different kinds of forms that like if you take issue with him having any regional variants on here, I mean, you could switch that out for something else. Uh I'm not exactly sure what else there really could be as far as like, different kinds of forms, but I think if he were a professor of forms, this is a pretty solid list of Pokemon that fully represent that. So I mentioned Samson Oak, and I am actually going to be talking about him as well. So, like I said, his field of study, he focuses both on the regional variants and also the totem Pokemon phenomena of the island. So I wanted his first team to be a bunch of totem Pokemon. In Ultra Sun and Moon, depending on how many stickers you collect and give him, he will give you a bunch of like I don't know where he gets them, but he gives you a totem Pokemon, like if it's 10 stickers, he'll give you Gumshoos or Raticate, depending on the game, etc. So his team will be a bunch of the Pokemon that he could theoretically give you. Those being Lurantis, Marowak, Araquanid, because I like him having a Fire Grass Water core to help mirror regular Oak, Gumshoos, Mimikyu, and Rabombi. But that is the totem team, and I also wanted him to have um, a regional variant team. And we're keeping the Marowak here, but we're adding Alolan Exeggutor to also mirror the Exeggutor on regular Oak's team from the very beginning. Alolan Sandslash, Raticate, Alolan Dugtrio, and Alolan Golem. Any one of these could really be the ace. Arguably, it probably should be Alolan Exeggutor. It's definitely the highest base stat total on here, but I don't know. I personally have a soft spot for Alolan Golem. I think it looks perfectly goofy. I think it just, no, I think it fits as his ace. Okay, moving on to Professor Magnolia. Her field of study is the Dynamax phenomena. So, since that is her field of study, similar to Professor Sycamore, I want her to have a bunch of Pokemon that are capable of Gigantamaxing. Um, However, I believe in the anime she has a Sinistea, and it just feels very right for, this nice old British lady to have a Pokemon that is literally a cup of tea. So her first Pokemon is a Poltegeist. Again, I just think that fits her perfectly. Orbeetle. Um, it's wild that no major trainer in the base games of Sword and Shield use Orbeetle. Not even the Avery or whatever that that guy from the Isle of Armor DLC. Even though he's a psychic specialist, he doesn't have an Orbeetle. I did fix that in my Rivals video, which I'll also link up there. But she should definitely have an Orbeetle. Appleton, because grandma's like baking pie, so Appleton. Um, Corviknight, her little staff thing literally has a Corvisquire on it, so I think she should have a Corviknight. Kingler is one that it's very funny that Kingler has a Gigantamax form. Like no one uses it. No one in real life used it. Like, it's not even that good, but like I don't know. It's kind of fun. Like you know, Britain has a monarch, so maybe she has a Kingler. Hmm. And then I gave her the one Gigantamax Pokemon I did give her is Butterfree for no other reason other than I just really like Gigantamax Butterfree. No one else has one, and I don't know. I just for some reason in my head feel like it fits her the best. Next up, Professor Laventon. Now his field of study is the region of Hisui. Um, he goes there with the research team to well, research this brand new region. However, it is heavily implied that he is actually from Galar. A lot of his mannerisms and like a lot of his dialogue feels very British. Like his Pokedex entries that he writes mention Copper Raja, whereas in the original, in from Red and Blue all the way to Gen 8, that same Pokedex for Raichu usually would mention Indian elephant, whereas here he specifies Copper Raja. So he clearly knows what a Copper Raja is. Um, and he's from another region, therefore I feel like it makes sense he'd be from Galar. And that's is not canon, but it's one of those things that like so much is pointing to it. I'd be surprised if it weren't what they were going for. So I decided to give him one Pokemon that was from the Galar region, and then five Pokemon that were all either Hisui variants or evolutions of Hisui Pokemon. So I gave him a Double. Just I feel like that's the Pokemon that is most representative of the entire region. And then Hisui Braviary, Wordeer, Basculegion, Sneasler, and Ursaluna. Now, I wanted to give him a bunch of Pokemon that were Hisui, either variants or evolutions thereof, um, that were none of the, what are they called? They're not Titans. Those like Ace, like can't remember what they're called, but like those mini bosses where you like do like the dodge rolls and like throw stuff at them in order to calm them down. Um, so I wanted to give him a bunch of Pokemon that weren't any of those. So I picked these five. However, after I picked these five, I then realized that they just happened to be the same five that the trainer uses as ride Pokemon. Um, and I think that's fine. Like you could switch out any of these for like Overquill or Zoroark or Gudra. There might be one or two others, but I feel like these five fit him well enough. And then also Dubwool from his original region. Next up, we have Professor Sada. Now, Sada and Turo, wanting to analyze their teams is actually kind of the reason why I made this entire project because when I did my champions video, I specifically did champions, former champions, and Pokemon or trainers on champion level, including trainers like Red and Honey and like a couple other people that aren't technically like champions at the time you fight them, but clearly have Pokemon on that same level. I totally meant to bring up Sada and Turo. I just, when making the presentation, I just left them out. They are very in this, they're pretty much in the same boat as Red in Gold and Silver, where they're at the very end of the game. They're considered the super boss character that, really tests your strength at the very end of the game. So I wanted to talk about them, and I basically built back for them. They're made entire teams for everyone else because they already have teams, and they're very good teams. They're both Sada and Turo. Their whole thing is studying the Area Zero crater and studying the paradox phenomena. So they have a bunch of Pokemon that are paradox Pokemon. So the Ring, Screamtail, Brewbonnet, Fluttermane, Sandy Shock, Roaring Moon. The only ones that aren't here are uh Great Tusks and then Koraidon, but I think this team is really good as it is. So yeah, there's no real need to change it. So moving on to Turo, same exact thing. He already has a absolutely amazing team of Iron Moth, Bundle, Iron Hands, Iron Jugulus, Iron Thorns, Iron Valiant. Now, your feelings towards these specific Paradox Pokemon may vary. I know some people really love the past Paradox ones. I don't love the future ones because they're basically just robot versions um, of current Pokemon. And yeah, Jugulus and Thorns are very uncreative. I do not like those, but I've come around a lot on the other four. I Iron Bundle, especially like in battle, I think they do a lot of fun things with his animations. Iron Valiant is obviously incredible. Um, I've always really liked Iron Hands, and Iron Moth has even kind of grown on me, but yeah, Jugulus and Thorns, those two arc me. But regardless, overall, it is still a very, very solid team. Now, before like like last night, like not even 8 hours ago, this was my presentation. Uh, but then I was in the shower and I remembered that there is actually one other professor that I theoretically could make a team for, that being Professor Willow. He is the professor from Pokemon Go. His field of study is also habitats. Uh, I guess he's definitely the least fleshed out um professor. Like even though like his game has technically been like the most developed, weirdly enough, because it's been going for 8 years now since 2016. Um, so he he definitely has, I don't know, like it was kind of hard, but also it kind of came together well enough. Um, there are a couple of Pokemon that were first introduced through Pokemon Go, which is actually what made me like remember that he existed. I was just for some reason thinking about Meltan, and then like, oh wait, Meltan was first introduced in Pokemon Go. Melmetal would be a good Pokemon for Willow, and then I went from there. But I got those two, and then I kind of got stuck a little bit. I looked on his Wikipedia page and I ended up with a team that I think actually fits him and everything Pokemon Go represents very nicely. So, starting off with Dragonite, not only is it a very rare Pokemon, since he, focuses on Pokemon habitats. I just like the idea of, kind of like with Birch, where he, had a bunch of Pokemon that were very rare in the region that of the areas of the region that they're from. Dragonite is, among the rarest Kanto Pokemon. He also is stated to have a very close working relationship with Professor Oak, so him having a good, strong Kanto Pokemon makes sense. But also, Dragonite was the first ever non-starter community day Pokemon. So I think him having a Dragonite with Draco Meteor would feel really cool here. Wug Trio, for the same thing as Dragonite, he is said to be colleagues with Jacques, who is one of the professors at the school in Scarlet and Violet. And Jacques's whole thing is he's researching the like convergent variant phenomenon, that being Wug Trio and Toadscruel. There might be a couple, like there weren't that many of them. I wish there were more. Um, I know it feels like one of those things they kind of tacked on last minute because they focus more on the Paradox Pokemon, but I kind of wish there were at least, three or four more conversion forms because I really like the idea of these Pokemon that, are a different type that have the same stats as the Pokemon that are from another region. I kind of wish, I kind of hope in future games you know, they they compound on that further. But Wug Trio is actually present in Pokemon Go as of like last April or something during their Return to Kanto event. One of the like rewards is a Wiglet, so you can have a Wug Trio. Goldingo, Gimmighoul was actually first teased in Pokemon Go. It was just this little thing that you saw randomly one day. It's like you don't know what it was, and then you click on it, it didn't really do anything. Um, so I think it's not even like the whole treasure chest is like the little roaming form one. Like it was a very nice tie-in to Scarlet and Violet because then, when you got into Scarlet and Violet, you were already primed to kind of look for these things around the region. So I think that's a lot of fun. So he should have a Goldingo. Mega Beedrill is when they introduced Mega Evolutions, Mega Beedrill for some reason was included in the first batch along with the starters or maybe one or two others, but Beedrill was there day one with Mega Evolutions. And along with that, it was real that he is also pals with Professor Sycamore, so I think he should have a Mega Evolution. Same thing with Toxtricity. Toxtricity is one of the few Gigantamax forms that is not one of the starter Pokemon that is in Pokemon Go. So since he's is said to be colleagues with Magnolia, I think he should have a Gigantamax Pokemon. And then Melmetal, this was absolutely wild. I remember being there day like when this happened. It was during the Chikorita Day event back in like 2018. I was in college with like a group of friends at the time who were all way into Pokemon Go. The community day ended, and then we just saw a bunch of these little like balls that had like a gold thing on their head. Like what, like click on it, it would just disappear. Like we didn't know what was going on. Um, so that was wild to witness, like in the moment. Only to then find out later that this was a Pokemon that they created specifically for Pokemon Go that can only be evolved in Pokemon Go. If you transfer Meltan into uh Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, you cannot evolve it. It has to be evolved in Pokemon Go, which is absolutely wild, but I think a lot of fun. And Melmetal, it does have a Gigantamax form. However, it is not accessible in Pokemon Go for some reason, even though, like I said, Melmetal is only really available technically in its truest form in Go. So I feel it should have been one of the first to get Gigantamax, but regardless, I'm sure it'll get there eventually. But in every promotional art for Willow since Meltan was announced, Meltan has been in at least a lot of the like card, like trainer, TCG art, the other promotional material and stuff. Meltan has been associated with Willow, so he should have Melmetal. And yeah, I think this ended up being a very solid team that just represents everything that Pokemon Go has, was and has become. It's definitely the least workshopped. Like I said, I had maybe like, two waking hours to like actually put it together. Whereas all of the others I've been, workshopping for like over a week now. So just like with any and all of these, presentations, but especially these ones I made today, please let me know if you have any other suggestions. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate, all the feedback I've gotten on on these last several videos I've made. I've really enjoyed making every single one of these videos I've made ever since my first gym leader analysis video. I've just really felt this creative urge to, just keep analyzing and just, keep thinking about this franchise that I love. If you have any suggestions for any future videos you would like me to do, please let me know. And like I said, if you have any suggestions or thoughts about any of the teams that I made now, do you have any criticisms, anything I missed, any trainers that I missed? There are a couple that, like Sonia, I might make a part two to my creating teams for like random NPCs. Like my last video, I might include her in that if I ever get around to that. Um, but yeah, if you have any thoughts about any of that, please let me know down below. I hope to continue making these kinds of videos at least throughout the majority of 2025. I currently have planned out an entire like roadmap for this year where hopefully if I can keep the schedule every 2 weeks, I should have a new video for at least 20 or so videos, depending on how things shake out. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you continue this ride with me. And with that, I will see you all next time.